1. c4. The English opening immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares to control the d5 square, offering flexibility in pawn structure and a wide range of possible continuations depending on Black's response. This move develops a knight towards the center while keeping flexible pawn structures, common in many Indian defenses and the Queen's Indian defense. This move establishes a strong central pawn presence and prepares to challenge Black's knight for control of the d5 square, aiming for a King's Indian defense or a Queen's Indian defense structure. This move signals the intention to transpose into a King's Indian defense or Grunfeld defense structure, where Black will fianchetto the King's bishop to g7 to control the long diagonal. This move continues the development of White's pieces, preparing to castle and supporting the central pawns, while also potentially allowing for systems like the Saemisch or classical King's Indian defense. This move firmly establishes the King's Indian defense structure, with the bishop on g7 aiming towards White's queenside and preparing for a kingside fianchetto and potential central pawn breaks. This move, e4, establishes White's central pawn presence and prepares to develop the kingside pieces, aiming for a strong pawn center against Black's fianchettoed bishop. This move, d6, solidifies White's pawn center and prepares for the fianchetto of the bishop to e6, aiming to challenge White's control of the d4 square. This move solidifies the center, preparing for a potential kingside attack while creating a less dynamic pawn structure. Castling safely secures the king and prepares to bring the rook into play on the central files, a standard defensive and developmental maneuver in this King's Indian setup. Developing the bishop to e3 supports the e4 pawn and prepares for potential kingside castling, reinforcing White's central pawn presence in this King's Indian defense setup. This move initiates a thematic pawn break in the King's Indian defense, challenging White's central control and aiming to open lines for Black's pieces. This move establishes a firm pawn chain, limiting Black's queenside development and preparing to launch a kingside attack by further advancing the f-pawn. This move marks a common repositioning in the King's Indian defense, as the knight retreats to e8 to support a potential c5 pawn break and clear the f6 square for a different piece. This move develops the queen to a more active square, supporting the potential advance of the e-pawn and preparing to castle queenside, which is often a strategic goal in this type of setup. Black aggressively challenges White's central pawn structure with this pawn push, aiming to open lines for piece activity and potentially disrupt White's king safety. Castling queenside initiates a dynamic king-side attack, creating an opposite side pawn storm scenario against Black's potentially exposed king. This move, knight to a6, initiates a long-term strategic maneuver to potentially activate the knight on the queenside and challenge White's central pawn structure or prepare a queenside expansion. This move develops the bishop to an active square, eyeing the kingside and supporting the pawn push while maintaining control of the central dark squares. This move aims to control the central d5 square and challenge White's pawn chain by preparing to exchange the knight for White's bishop or pawn, potentially opening lines for Black's pieces. This move reroutes the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the central pawn push and preparing to control the long diagonal if Black's center should crumble. This captures the central pawn, opening lines and challenging White's ambitious central pawn structure, aiming to gain space and potentially activate Black's pieces. This pawn capture opens the f-file for your rook and begins to dismantle Black's central pawn chain, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around Black's king. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to challenge white's pawn chain and potentially support a d5 pawn push to gain space. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and prevent black's knight from reaching g4, a common maneuver in this type of fianchetto structure. This move repositions the knight to the edge of the board, potentially preparing to challenge white's kingside pawn structure or support an eventual f5 advance, though it risks becoming a target on the flank. This move develops the knight to an active square, supporting the advance of the f-pawn and preparing to castle queenside, reinforcing white's central control and attacking potential in a standard King's Indian structure. This move develops the queen to a more active square, eyeing the f2 pawn and potentially supporting a kingside pawn push. The king's side shuffle on this move offers prophylaxis by moving the king away from the central and queenside files and preparing for potential future pawn advances on the queenside. This move initiates a queenside expansion, aiming to gain space and create attacking chances by challenging white's control of the a-file and potentially preparing a breakthrough with a4. This move repositions the queen to a safer square and clears the d2 square, potentially preparing for a pawn push with d5 or supporting an attack on the kingside. This move, bd7, is a logical step to connect the rooks and prepare for castling queenside, while also supporting the advance of the c-pawn, a common theme in this King's Indian defense setup. This move decisively contests the open f-file, aiming to prepare for an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside while also potentially supporting a future g4 gram5 advance to break open black's kingside defenses. The move k7 prepares to connect the rooks and potentially support the advance of the kingside pawns, while also guarding against tactical threats on the c5 square. This exchange on the f-file resolves the tension and clears the way for white's rook to potentially become more active, while also forcing black to decide on the placement of their queen. This recapture on f8 clears the f-file for your rook and allows for dynamic counterplay in the center, which is crucial given white's advanced pawn structure. This move reorganizes the rooks after the exchange on f8, aiming to control the now open f-file and prepare for potential central pawn pushes or kingside attacks. Black aims to activate the queen by connecting with white's weakened kingside, potentially creating tactical opportunities along the h4-d8 diagonal or even aiming for a kingside attack. This move aims to prevent black's queenside expansion with b5, solidifying white's queenside pawn structure and preparing to potentially advance the a-pawn. Further, black's exchange of rooks on the f-file opens up the h-file for their queen to potentially attack the white king, but it also removes a key defender of their own king, creating strategic imbalances. Recapturing with the queen on f1 opens the f-file for white's rook and centralizes the queen, preparing to contest the open lines that are developing. The knight repositions to f6, preparing to defend the weakened kingside light squares and potentially contest the open f-file that white has achieved, aiming to neutralize white's attacking potential. The move qf3 repositions the queen from the central file, aiming to avoid further exchanges and potentially prepare for kingside action or to support the advance of the g-pawn. Black's move b6 solidifies the queenside and prepares for a potential queenside pawn advance, challenging white's control of the c5 square and potentially opening a diagonal for the bishop. King safety is paramount. Moving the king to a more secure position on a2 is a prudent defensive maneuver, anticipating potential threats along the open a-file or from black's queen. Black's knight repositions to a6, preparing to contest the c5 square and potentially support a queenside pawn advance, while also anticipating white's attempts to exploit the weakened kingside. The move qg3 repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to support a potential g4 advance or to reinforce the kingside if black attempts an attack there. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, aiming to exploit white's slightly uncoordinated pieces and potentially create winning chances in the ensuing endgame. This exchange simplifies the position by removing queens and rooks, leading to a more endgame-oriented phase where white's knight on g3 is well placed to control key central squares and potentially support a kingside attack or central pawn break. The king now repositions towards the center to participate in the endgame, potentially aiming for central control and to support pawn advances. The bishop repositions to d2, aiming to develop the queen's bishop to a more active diagonal and potentially support a future kingside pawn advance or control key central squares. This move repositions the knight to a more passive square, potentially preparing to bring it back to the kingside to support the weakened pawn structure. The knight repositioning to d1 aims to reroute towards the queenside, potentially supporting a b5-b4 pawn push or finding better squares like c3 or b2 to contest black's knight on a6 and bolster white's queenside pawn structure. The bishop repositions to h6 to contest the open diagonal and potentially exchange itself for white's knight, aiming to weaken white's king's defense. White repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge black's weakened kingside light squares and potentially support a future g4 push. Black's a7 aims to reposition the knight to a more active square on f5 or g6, challenging white's bishop and potentially supporting further kingside pawn advances or central breaks. This move repositions the knight to a more flexible square, preparing to support the central pawn push or swing over to the kingside to bolster defenses and potentially target the f6 knight. Black's bishop repositions to g5, aiming to exchange itself for white's knight on g3, which would improve black's pawn structure and activate the bishop on the a7-1 diagonal. This move prepares to expand on the queenside with rb1 and b4, aiming to gain space and potentially create weaknesses in black's position. This pawn thrust aims to expand black's kingside space, potentially preparing to challenge white's central control or create attacking opportunities with a subsequent g5. This move repositions the king to a safer square on the queenside, anticipating potential queenside expansion and preparing to connect the rooks later. Black repositions the bishop to g5 to contest the d1-h5 diagonal and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. This move initiates an attempt to gain space on the queenside and potentially open lines for the rook on a1, disrupting black's compact pawn structure and creating opportunities for white's minor pieces to become more active. Capturing on b4 opens the a-file for white's rook, potentially creating pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and allowing for greater piece activity. This pawn recapture reopens the a-file for white's rook, allowing for potential pressure along the queenside and also prepares to advance the b-pawn for further queenside expansion. This pawn push aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and gain space, potentially opening lines for black's rook on the h-file or allowing the knight to reposition. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's kingside pawn structure and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or attack. The bishop repositions to c8, preparing to eye the queenside and potentially support a future b5 pawn advance or retreat to safety if attacked. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support a kingside pawn advance or potentially swing over to the queenside to challenge black's maneuvering pieces. The king actively participates in the endgame, seeking safer squares while preparing to support pawn advances on the kingside. This move prepares to redeploy the knight to a more active central square or to support pawn advances on the kingside, seeking to exploit the awkward placement of black's king and bishops. This pawn push initiates a kingside attack, aiming to open lines against white's uncastled king and exploit the weakened dark squares around it. Capturing the pawn on g4 opens the h-file, creating potential attacking chances for white's rook and offering more space for white's pieces to maneuver towards the black king. The pawn capture on g4 opens the h-file for black's rook, creating immediate attacking potential against white's king, while also challenging white's pawn structure and central control. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square on g4, potentially targeting the black king's weakened kingside pawn structure and creating further attacking opportunities. This move reroutes the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially targeting the weak f2 pawn and preparing for future kingside activity or defense. This knight move repositions the knight to a more central square, preparing to support the advance of the kingside pawns or to jump to a more active square like e3 or d4. This pawn advance initiates a critical fight for central space and queen activity, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's rooks. The knight repositions to d3, aiming to control the central squares and potentially support a kingside pawn advance with f4. The move 40 kg5 repositions the king to a more active central square, preparing to support the pawn advance and potentially participate in the endgame, while also evading threats on the kingside. This pawn capture simplifies the position, creating potential for a tactical skirmish as black's king is exposed on the g-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the central control and potentially create threats against white's king or pawns. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the critical h5e1 diagonal and potentially support a kingside advance or counterplay. This move repositioning the bishop to e3 aims to contest the open g-file and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or exploit weaknesses in white's pawn structure. The knight repositions to f1, aiming to reroute towards the kingside to support the pawn advance and potentially participate in an attack on the vulnerable black king. This move seeks to exploit the weakened light squares around the black king and create tactical opportunities by forcing the knight away from its defensive post. The king vacates the dangerous d4 square, preparing to shuttle to safety on the kingside and avoid the immediate threat from the bishop and knight. This exchange simplifies the position, removing a key defender of white's kingside and resolving the tension around the f3 pawn structure, leading to a more open endgame where black's knight on e3 becomes a powerful attacking piece. This move breaks white's kingside pawn structure, creating doubled f-pawns but opening the g-file for the rook and potentially creating an outpost for the knight on f3. After the exchange of pieces and the opening up of the kingside, white has established a protected passed pawn on g3, and black's king is exposed, making it crucial for black to consolidate and find defensive resources, as this knight move aims to reposition defensively and challenge white's potential central advances. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the potential weaknesses around black's king and supporting a kingside pawn push. The knight repositions to g6, aiming to bolster the kingside pawn advance and potentially contest the light squares if white continues to advance on the kingside. This move initiates a slow, positional maneuvering to centralize the king and prepare for a queenside expansion, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on white's b-pawn. The king centralizes, aiming to support the pawn advances on the kingside and potentially participate in defensive or offensive operations across the board. The move nh2 is a strategic repositioning of the knight to b3 or c4, aiming to support the pawn advance and potentially exploit the semi-open file on the kingside. This move repositions the black king to a more central and active square, preparing for potential pawn advances or to support other pieces in the endgame. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge black's well-placed bishop on g4 and potentially support pawn advances on the kingside. The black king's repositioning to d7 aims to centralize and improve its defensive capabilities, while also preparing to support potential pawn advances on the kingside or to facilitate a future kingside castling if white's attack on the queenside falters. The knight repositions to a more active square on h6, aiming to improve its control over the kingside and potentially support future pawn advances or exchanges. The pawn thrust on c6 aims to create a more solid pawn chain and potentially open lines for the queen or bishop on the queenside, but it also weakens the d6 square. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on f5, eyeing the weak squares around black's king and preparing to support a potential kingside advance or control key central squares. This move is a desperate attempt to create complications and potentially a passed pawn on the queenside, as white's kingside majority threatens to advance. This move repositions the white king to safety on the queenside, preventing potential threats from the black knight and preparing to support the central pawns. This pawn capture opens the b-file and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially creating opportunities to activate black's pieces. The exchange of queens has simplified the position, and white's king is now more exposed in the center, requiring careful prophylactic play to avoid tactical threats. This pawn sacrifice opens the c-file for your rook and aims to disrupt white's king safety by creating potential attacking lines. The king recaptures the pawn on d5, centralizing its position to support the connected passed pawns on the queenside. This move re-establishes central control and prepares to challenge white's dominant knight on f3, with further pawn advances or knight repositioning, aiming to break the static pawn structure. The move kc4 is a strategic repositioning of the king to a more active central square, aiming to participate in the endgame and potentially support the pawn advances on the queenside or centralize further. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the g4 pawn push and potentially create counterplay against white's king. This move breaks open the queenside pawn structure, aiming to create a passed pawn and activate the bishop pair on the queenside. The move 56, nd8 is a strategic repositioning aiming to support the eventual advance of the queenside pawns, particularly the c-pawn, and to prepare for potential defensive maneuvers against white's active king. White activates the bishop, aiming to support the pawn advance on the kingside and prepare for potential future pawn breaks or to contest the open files. The knight's repositioning to e1 aims to centralize it and prepare for potential pawn pushes or support for the king. while white's bishop on e1 controls the b4-e1 diagonal and prevents further intrusion of black's king towards the queenside. This move injects crucial initiative, forcing black's king into a precarious position and potentially setting up a decisive tactical sequence. The king retreats to the relative safety of the 7th rank, preparing to support the queenside pawns and avoid further checks along the open diagonals. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the important central squares and support potential kingside activity or reinforce key defensive positions. The king retreats to the center to support the pawn majority and prepare for potential pawn breaks, aiming to activate itself in the endgame. bd2 aims to connect the rooks and prepare to contest the open b file, simultaneously reinforcing the king's pawn structure while the opponent's king remains somewhat exposed. This move aims to activate the knight to the central squares, preparing to support the pawn push or challenge white's bishop on e1. This move forces black's king to a less safe square, allowing white to further consolidate its advantage by repositioning its knight and potentially preparing to support a passed pawn. This move repositions the king to safety from the knight check, but it also abandons the control of the d7 square, allowing white's knight to gain a more active outpost on f5. This knight move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support a potential kingside advance or to participate in controlling the center in the endgame. This move continues white's pressure along the h-file and maintains the threat of a knight fork on f7, forcing black to defend and potentially restrict his king's mobility. This move intends to contest the queenside majority by preparing to advance the b-pawn and create a passed pawn or gain space for the knight. This knight check forces the white king to a more vulnerable square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside or center. This move repositions the white king, preparing to defend the pawn chain and potentially support a later advance of the d-pawn to d6, while also avoiding checks from black's knight on a5. Black's king must find a safer square, as the knight on g7 is poised to deliver a potentially decisive check along the diagonal after white's next move. The knight moves to d5, controlling key central squares and preparing to support a pawn advance or contest the d-file, while also eyeing potential forks on c7. The move repositions the knight to b7, reinforcing the queenside pawn structure and preparing for potential counterplay or consolidation, while the king remains somewhat exposed. This move aims to centralize the king, a crucial strategic step in the endgame to activate its defensive and offensive potential while preparing to contest the central squares and support pawn advances. This move repositions the bishop to an active diagonal, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawns and prepare for potential pawn advances, especially after white's knight retreat. White correctly recognizes the critical situation on the b7 pawn, which is currently undefended, and uses the knight to reposition for an attack. The knight's move to f8 seems passive, potentially repositioning to defend the kingside or prepare for a future advance on the g-file. But it relinquishes control of crucial central squares and does little to contest white's active piece play. The move Kd3 is aimed at centralizing the king, preparing to activate it in the endgame and potentially support the passed pawns on the kingside or oppose white's own pawns. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to create threats on the kingside and potentially support a pawn push. The bishop maneuvers to e1, preparing to redeploy to the king's side, aiming to support an eventual pawn push and attack the black king, while also covering potential checks. This move initiates a thematic maneuver to reposition the knight to the central square e6, aiming to restrict white's king and potentially create attacking chances. This move continues white's centralizing plan for the king, aiming to support potential pawn advances and control key squares in the endgame. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, specifically preparing to challenge white's control of the d6 pawn and potentially support a future pawn advance. White centralizes the knight to a more active square, aiming to control key squares and prepare for potential breakthroughs or defensive maneuvers in the center of the board. The move, bg1, is a clever maneuver to activate the bishop on the queenside, aiming to support the advance of the knight and potentially create counterplay against white's king, especially if white's knight moves away from the g-file. The bishop repositions to d2, preparing to potentially exchange itself for the active knight on g6, simplifying into an endgame where white's king can become more actively involved. This move reactivates the bishop, preparing to potentially exchange on f1 or reposition to a more active square, as white's knight is currently well placed on g7 and the bishop on d2 is somewhat passive. This move aims to reroute the bishop to a more active square, preparing to support a potential pawn push or improve piece coordination in the endgame. This move forces the white king into a passive position, setting up the possibility of a discovered attack or a stronger knight fork if white's king moves to a less advantageous square. The move kc3 repositions the white king to a more active and centralized square, aiming to support its pawns and potentially participate in the endgame's tactical skirmishes. The knight's repositioning to f8 aims to redeploy to a more active square, potentially g6 or h7, to support the king's side or participate in future pawn breaks, while also defending against potential incursions by white's knight on g7. This move repositioned the knight to a central outpost on g7, aiming to control key squares and potentially support a kingside advance while also keeping options open for defense or counterattack on the queenside. The move continues white's positional pressure, aiming to exploit the queenside weakness while black seeks to consolidate their pieces and defend against further incursions. This move repositions the king to a more central and active square, preparing to support the queenside pawns and potentially coordinate a defense against black's active pieces. The knight repositions to f8, eyeing a potential retreat to g6 to defend the pawn on h5 if white's bishop advances to g7, or to support a kingside pawn push if the opportunity arises. nc3 aims to improve the knight's position by bringing it to a more central square, potentially supporting central pawn advances or attacking weaknesses on the queenside. This move looks to be a tactical misstep, as the knight on g6 is now vulnerable to an immediate threat from the rook on c3, potentially leading to a loss of material or a significant positional disadvantage. This move aims to improve the knight's position by bringing it to a more active square, potentially supporting advances on the queenside or defending weak points. The bishop repositions to f2, aiming to control the critical g3 square and prepare for potential counterplay along the h5e8 diagonal. This move prepares to centralize the king, seeking a more active role in the endgame and potentially supporting pawn advances while simultaneously defending against black's aggressive knight maneuvering. This move, 79, bg1, repositions the bishop to a central, active square, supporting the knight's advanced position and preparing to control key squares while aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. This move repositions the king to a more active square, aiming to centralize it and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside or to support piece activity. The knight retreat to f2 aims to regroup and prepare for potential central pawn advances or to support other pieces, especially if the opponent's knight attempts to infiltrate further into white's position. This move repositions the white king to a more active square, aiming to participate in the pawn endgame by supporting the b-pawn's advance and potentially creating new attacking opportunities. The move b1+ is a crucial tempo-gaining move that forces the white king to an even more exposed position on the second rank, potentially leading to further tactical opportunities for black's pieces. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on c4 with the knight, aiming to simplify the position and potentially create a passed pawn in the center. The knight repositions to b7, aiming to potentially support a central advance with c5 or to maneuver towards the queenside, seeking active squares and improving its coordination with the other pieces. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to create threats against black's kingside pawn structure and potentially support a breakthrough with the queen or king. White's knight has maneuvered to a strong attacking post, and black's nf8 must now reposition to defend the critical c6 square and support the eventual advance of the queenside pawns. The move b3 aims to improve the bishop's activity and control of the d4 square, potentially preparing for a pawn push or rerouting the bishop to a more effective diagonal, while also defending the knight on f3. With black's king and knights on the edge of the board, the move na6 seeks to consolidate the position by connecting the knights and preparing to support potential pawn advances on the kingside or centralize the knight if opportunities arise. The move kc4 aims to centralize the white king, preparing to support the pawn majority on the kingside and potentially engage in pawn play or defend against black's nf8 g6 ideas. This move continues white's plan to control the queenside by consolidating pieces and preparing a pawn advance, while black aims to re-establish piece activity and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. This move prepares to advance the b-pawn to b7, aiming to create a passed pawn and gain space on the queenside, which will restrict black's pieces. The knight's check on a5 exploits white's king's compromised position on the queenside, forcing white to address the immediate threat and potentially disrupting white's coordination. The move to k3 repositions the white king to a more active central square, preparing to support the passed b-pawn and potentially counter black's king's activity. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on the queenside, aiming to support potential pawn advances or attack white's kingside structure in the endgame. This move prepares to challenge black's centralized knight on a6, aiming to activate white's own pieces and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside if white can gain space. This knight move is a strategic repositioning, aiming to bring the knight to a more active square on c2 where it can support potential pawn advances or defend key squares, while also evading the discovered attack that was threatened. This move, k2, is a crucial step in activating the white king, moving it out of the corner and towards the center where it can participate in the endgame, which is rapidly approaching given the limited material on the board. The capture of the knight on d5 is a critical decision, simplifying the position and potentially leading to an endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside might become a factor, but it also releases black from pressure and allows their king to become more active. This pawn capture finally resolves the tension in the center, creating a passed pawn on d5 for white and opening up the position for the bishops to become more active. This move aims to activate the bishop by repositioning it to a more dynamic square, potentially eyeing weak points in white's pawn structure or creating defensive options. The king repositions to the center, aiming to control critical squares and prepare for potential pawn advances while keeping an eye on the knight's activity. This move is a crucial step to centralize the king, preparing to support the remaining pawns and potentially contest the open files as white's king also ventures into the center. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside advance or preparing to contest control of the central dark squares as the game enters its endgame phase. The move 92. K7 is a logical repositioning of the king to a more active central square, aiming to support the potential pawn advances and coordinate with the remaining pieces in a complex endgame. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on f2, aiming to support the advance of the g-pawn and prepare to control the crucial d4-f2 diagonal, which will be important for white's king safety and potential counterplay. The pawn structure has significantly simplified, and black's king is now actively centralized, aiming to control key squares and prepare for potential pawn advances while white tries to coordinate his remaining pieces. This knight move strategically repositions the piece to a more active square, eyeing potential threats on the kingside and aiming to restrict black's minor pieces while preparing for further pawn pushes or exchanges. The king must remain active to support the pawns and coordinate with the remaining pieces. So 94. K7 correctly brings the king towards the center of the board to prepare for further action and potential pawn advances. This move prepares to activate the bishop by relocating it to a more dynamic diagonal after the knight on g6 is potentially dislodged, aiming to exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The move 95. Kc8 aims to centralize the king, preparing to defend the queenside pawn structure and potentially support an advance of the a-pawn, while avoiding the checks on the b-file that arise if the king ventures further towards the center. This move reinforces the control of the d8 square and prepares to support the pawn advance with the king, which is crucial for maneuvering the king to a more active endgame position and contesting the remaining central squares. The black king needs to be more active in the endgame to support its pawns and coordinate with its remaining pieces, and bringing it to b7 is a sensible step in that direction. This move aims to control the c7 square, preventing the black king from accessing it and preparing to advance the b-pawn further, thereby solidifying white's queenside space advantage. The move 97. Ka6 aims to activate the king and prepare to support the knight's advance, but it might be too slow to counter white's mating threats on the kingside. This move continues the king's repositioning, aiming to create a secure outpost for the knight and prepare for potential pawn breaks or to coordinate an attack on the queenside. The bishop retreats to c5 to defend the advanced pawn on b6 and prepare to contest the c-file, which will open up if white plays kc3. The move nf7 aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a future kingside attack or improving its control over key central squares, while also eyeing weaknesses around black's king. The knight repositions to b7, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential knight maneuvers to c5 or d6, while maintaining pressure on white's advanced pawns. This move prepares to activate the king by moving it towards the center, aiming to support the pawn structure and potentially control key squares in the endgame.